When Rachel Carter risks everything to save her sick daughter, she turns to a dangerous man for help. Just as she's about to sign away her child's future, Big Shaq steps in. But his motives aren't what they seem. As Rachel uncovers a shocking link between Shaq and her late husband, a ruthless enemy plots his revenge. Now, caught between betrayal and survival, Rachel must make an impossible choice. Will she lose everything, or outplay the people who want to break her? Watch now for a story packed with twists, suspense, and high-stakes drama. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Rachel Carter sat in the cold, sterile office of Dr. Bennett, the head of pediatric cardiology, her hands gripping the arms of her chair like they were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Across from her, the doctor's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of look doctors wore when delivering bad news. Rachel's stomach twisted. "I know this is hard to hear, but Lily's condition is worsening," Dr. Bennett said gently. "Without surgery, she won't make it past the next few months." Rachel felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her 6-year-old daughter. Her baby. "There has to be something else we can do," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. Dr. Bennett sighed, sliding a folder across the desk. "There is." Rachel hesitated before opening it, and when she did, her world shattered. The estimated cost of the surgery, $250,000. Her hands trembled as she pushed the folder away. I don't have that kind of money." Dr. Bennett gave her a sympathetic look. "There are payment plans, financial assistance programs." Rachel cut him off, shaking her head. "I've already applied for everything, denied. They said I don't qualify." Dr. Bennett sighed again. "I wish I had better news, Rachel, but the hospital has policies. If the funds aren't secured within 30 days, we'll have to remove Lily from the transplant list." Rachel's entire body went numb. 30 days to come up with $250,000, or lose her daughter forever. The drive home was a blur. Rachel barely remembered parking her old sedan in front of their tiny apartment. The only thing she could hear was Lily's voice in the back seat, humming softly to herself, completely unaware that her mother's world was falling apart. Inside, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Loans, crowdfunding, government assistance, charities, every option, every possibility. One by one, the doors slammed shut. Personal loan, denied. Too much debt, too little income medical grants, all funds allocated. Try again next year charity programs, thousands of applicants ahead of her crowdfunding. A few donations trickled in, $5, $20, $50. Not enough. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't enough. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she stared at the screen, her reflection looking back at her in the dim light. For the first time, she felt truly helpless. Rachel spent the next week selling everything she owned. Her car? Gone. She'd take the bus. Her furniture? Sold piece by piece. Who needed a couch when her daughter's life was at stake? Her jewelry? Pawned off. Even her engagement ring from a marriage that had ended in heartbreak. She worked double shifts at the diner, her feet aching, her body running on coffee in desperation. Every dollar mattered. But at the end of the week, after endless sacrifices, she had barely scratched the surface. $15,000, a lifetime of effort. And still, nowhere near enough. The reality hit her like a freight train. She couldn't do this alone, which meant she had one last option, one she had never wanted to consider. Rachel sat across from Cameron Steele, a man known for helping people in desperate situations. For a price. They met in the back of a private club, a place where business deals happened in hushed tones, away from prying eyes. Cameron was calm, collected, sipping a glass of whiskey as he listened to Rachel's plea. When she finished, he leaned back, watching her like a predator sizing up its prey. $250,000. That's a big number, Rachel. Rachel swallowed hard. "I'll pay it back, whatever it takes." Cameron smirked. "I know you will. That's why I'm willing to help." Rachel held her breath. This was it. Then Cameron reached into his jacket, pulling out a document. He slid it across the table. Rachel picked it up, her eyes scanning the words, and her blood ran cold. This is a custody agreement. Cameron nodded. I cover the surgery. You have 6 months to pay me back. If you don't, he smiled. Lily becomes mine. Rachel's hands shook. You can't be serious. Cameron tilted his head. I'm very serious. You need money. I need guarantees. Rachel's breathing turned shallow. Sell everything? Yes. Work herself to death? Yes. Give up her daughter? Never. She stood abruptly, gripping the edge of the table. This is sick. Cameron shrugged. So is letting your daughter die. Rachel felt the room spin. She was trapped. Out of time. Out of options. Her hand clenched into a fist. She had no choice. She reached for the pen. Then, a deep voice interrupted. She's not signing that. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Rachel turned, her heart pounding. A man stood near the entrance, tall, broad, exuding a quiet kind of power. Big Shaq. Rachel recognized him immediately. Everyone did. Self-made millionaire, real estate mogul, a man with money, influence, and a reputation for never backing down. Cameron's smirk faltered for the first time. This isn't your business, Shaq. Shaq stepped forward, his gaze locked on Cameron. It is now. Rachel looked between them, confused, hopeful, terrified. Shaq turned to her, his voice steady. You don't need to do this. Rachel's lips parted. I don't? Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a check and placed it on the table. For the full amount. Cameron's eyes darkened. What's your angle? Shaq's expression remained unreadable. I don't like seeing good people get screwed. Rachel couldn't breathe. This had to be a trick, a setup. No one gives away that kind of money for nothing. But Shaq? He just leaned back, folding his arms, and waited. Cameron exhaled sharply, his frustration slipping through the cracks. He knew Shaq wasn't someone he could push. Finally, he grabbed the check, tucking it into his jacket. You're lucky I like money more than drama. He stood, giving Rachel one last look. If you ever change your mind? He smirked. You know where to find me. Then just like that, he walked away. Rachel sat there, stunned, shaking. Shaq watched her for a long moment before finally speaking. Your daughter's safe. That's all that matters. Rachel's eyes welled with tears. She had been ready to sacrifice everything. And then, in a single moment, a stranger had changed her life. But why? And more importantly, who exactly was Big Shaq? Rachel Carter had never felt this kind of exhaustion before. The kind that settled deep in her bones, making every breath feel heavier. The kind that turned hours into blurs, days into weeks, where the only thing that mattered was survival. Not for herself, but for Lily. Every second that passed was one step closer to losing her daughter, and she was running out of time. The first thing to go was the car. Rachel watched from the sidewalk as the buyer, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, examined it like he was inspecting a piece of junk. Never mind that it had gotten her through every struggle, every emergency, every late-night hospital run. He barely looked at her when he handed over $5,000 in cash. It was less than half of what the car was worth, but Rachel didn't argue. She took the money, shoving it deep into her worn-out purse. Every dollar counted. Next, she stripped her tiny apartment bare. The couch? Gone. The TV? Sold for pennies. Her grandmother's old china set? Pawned. She stared at the empty walls, the hollowed-out living room, and told herself it didn't matter. Lily was all that mattered. Then came the hardest sale. The engagement ring. Rachel hesitated, staring down at the small diamond resting in the velvet box. It wasn't from a love story. It wasn't from some grand romance. It was a symbol of a mistake, a past she wanted to erase. But somehow parting with it still hurt. The pawnshop owner didn't care. He barely glanced at it before offering $800. Rachel clenched her jaw. It had cost $5,000. She could have fought, argued, but there was no time for pride. She slid the box across the counter and took the money. Total saved, $15,000. And it still wasn't enough. Selling her belongings wasn't enough. So Rachel worked. And worked. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, her feet aching, hands blistered from carrying trays. She took on a second job at a 24-hour gas station, standing behind a counter under flickering lights, watching drunk customers stumble in at 3 a.m. She barely slept, barely ate. She existed on cheap coffee, leftover scraps from the diner, and the hope that she could make it just one more day. But even with all the hours, all the exhaustion, the money trickled in too slow. Rachel did the math over and over again. Even if she worked every single hour for the next 30 days, she wouldn't come close to the $250,000 she needed. Her body was breaking, her mind was breaking, and time was running out. Rachel sat on the floor of her empty apartment staring at the stack of medical bills piled in front of her. She had done everything right. She had begged, she had worked, she had sacrificed, and none of it mattered. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to cry. Crying didn't fix anything. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. There was only one option left. One she had promised herself she'd never consider. She scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she had saved years ago, a name she never wanted to see again. Cameron Steele. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Cameron Steele was not a good man. Everyone knew that. He was the type of man who didn't offer help. He offered deals. Deals that always came with a price. Rachel had seen what happened to people who owed him money. They lost everything. Some disappeared completely, but none of that mattered now. Because Lily was going to die. Rachel closed her eyes and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a smooth, amused voice answered. Rachel Carter. Been a long time. Her throat felt dry. I need money. There was a pause. Then a low chuckle. Of course you do. Rachel swallowed hard. Can we meet? Cameron's voice was laced with interest. You sure you want to do that? Number. But she had no choice. Yes. There was a beat of silence. Then, tomorrow, 8 p.m., I'll text you the location. The call disconnected. Rachel stared at her phone, her stomach twisting. She had just made a deal with the devil, and she had no idea if she would survive it. Rachel sat in the dimly lit back room of the Monarch, a private club reserved for the wealthy, the corrupt, and the untouchable. Everything about the place screamed power: mahogany walls, crystal chandeliers, hushed conversations carrying secrets worth millions. This was where people like Cameron Steele thrived. Rachel didn't belong here, but desperation didn't care where it dragged you. She gripped the edge of the sleek leather chair, her pulse hammering as she watched Cameron pour himself a drink. Like they were here for a casual business meeting. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of man who enjoyed making people wait. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to sit still. She wouldn't let him see her panic. Finally, he turned, sliding a glass of amber liquid across the table toward her. Whiskey? Rachel clenched her jaw. Just tell me the deal. Cameron smirked, settling into his chair. Straight to business. I respect that. He leaned forward, fingers tapping lightly against the glass. $250,000. Up front, no interest, no monthly payments. Rachel's breath caught. Too good to be true. And then, he continued, you pay me back in 6 months. If you don't. He reached inside his jacket, pulling out a neatly folded legal document. He flicked it across the table like a casual afterthought. Rachel picked it up with trembling hands. Her heart stopped. It wasn't just a contract, it was a custody transfer. If she failed to pay, Lily would legally belong to him. Rachel's vision blurred. Her fingers clenched the paper so tightly the edges bent. She looked up, her voice shaking. You can't be serious. Cameron tilted his head, his smirk never fading. Completely. Rachel's stomach churned. This wasn't a loan. It was a ransom. Rachel's breaths came fast and shallow as she forced herself to think. 6 months. She had 6 months to come up with $250,000. She had already sold everything, already worked herself to the edge of collapse. What was left? Her hands trembled as she stared at the contract. at Lily's name printed in black ink. She felt sick, like she was staring at a death certificate. Cameron sipped his drink, watching her, enjoying this. You're a smart woman, Rachel. You wouldn't be here if you had other options. She knew what he was doing, breaking her down, making her believe she had no choice. And the worst part? He was right. Rachel's vision swam, her ears rang. She felt the room closing in, the weight of Lily's tiny hand in hers, the sound of her daughter's laughter, the warmth of bedtime stories and whispered, "I love yous." Could she really risk losing her? Could she really sign her daughter away? Her fingers curled around the pen. Cameron leaned back, satisfied. He thought he had won. But then, a deep voice cut through the room. "She's not signing that." The room shifted instantly. Rachel turned, heart pounding. A man stood at the doorway, broad-shouldered, dressed in an effortlessly expensive suit. The kind of man who looked like he belonged in places like this, but carried himself like he didn't care. Big Shaq. Cameron's smirk faltered for the first time. "This isn't your business, Shaq." Shaq stepped forward, his eyes flicking to Rachel, then to the contract in her hands. His jaw tightened. "Looks like you made it mine." Cameron let out a slow breath, setting his glass down. "I don't remember inviting you." Shaq gave a dry chuckle. "You didn't." Rachel's pulse was racing. She knew who Big Shaq was. Everyone did. A self-made millionaire. A man who had built his empire from nothing. A man with power, influence, and connections. But why was he here? Why did he care? Shaq's gaze met hers. Steady. Unreadable. Then he turned back to Cameron. "The deal's off." Cameron exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't think you understand." Shaq cut him off. "I understand just fine." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a check, and tossed it onto the table. Rachel's breath hitched. Cameron frowned, flipping it over. His expression flickered. It was for the full amount. Silence. Rachel couldn't speak, couldn't move. Cameron let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "What's your angle?" Shaq's expression didn't change. "I don't like seeing good people get screwed." Cameron leaned back, his smirk returning. "You always did have a thing for charity cases." Shaq's jaw twitched, but his voice stayed calm. "Take the money, Cameron, and leave her alone." Rachel's fingers curled into fists. Was this real? Cameron stared at Shaq for a long moment. Then finally he shrugged. "Fine." He took the check, tucking it into his jacket. Then he looked at Rachel, his smirk turning cold. "But remember this. Debts don't always come in cash." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. Cameron stood, buttoned his suit, and walked out. The moment the door shut, the tension snapped like a rubber band. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her body sagging. She had been ready to sell her soul. And in a single moment, a stranger had stopped her. But why? And more importantly, who exactly was Big Shaq? Rachel sat frozen in her chair, the weight of the last few minutes pressing down on her like a collapsing building. Cameron Steele was gone, but his presence lingered like the stench of expensive cologne and bad intentions. Her hands were still clenched, nails digging into her palms as if letting go would send her spiraling into something even worse. Across from her, Big Shaq, the man who had just rewritten the course of her life in a single moment, leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable. The check was gone. The deal was off. But Rachel wasn't stupid. Nothing in this world came for free. Rachel straightened in her seat, forcing herself to meet Shaq's gaze. "Why did you do that?" Her voice came out rough, exhausted. Shaq exhaled through his nose, fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Because you were about to make a mistake you couldn't take back." Rachel's pulse hammered. She didn't need his pity. Didn't need some wealthy businessman swooping in like a hero in a bad movie. "You don't even know me." Shaq held her gaze. "I know enough." Rachel shook her head, pushing back from the table. "I don't take handouts." Shaq let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah? Well, you were about to hand your daughter over to the devil himself. Seemed like you were fresh out of choices." Rachel's stomach twisted. The words stung because they were true. "I don't owe you anything," she said, standing abruptly. Shaq didn't move, but his voice was sharp. "Sit down, Rachel." Something in his tone made her hesitate. Not threatening, not demanding, but firm, unshakable. She sat. Not because he told her to, but because she needed to know what kind of man would throw away that much money for a stranger. Shaq folded his hands on the table, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "You don't trust me. That's good. You shouldn't." Rachel tensed. "Then why are we still talking?" Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if deciding how much to say. "Because I have an offer that doesn't require you to sell your soul." Rachel swallowed hard. "Another deal." Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Rachel stared at it before hesitantly picking it up. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Her heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a contract. It was a hospital receipt, paid in full. Rachel's vision blurred. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. $250,000. Just like that. Paid. Her hands clenched around the paper. "Why?" Shaq leaned back, watching her carefully. "Because someone once did the same for me." Rachel's breath caught. This wasn't about charity. It was something deeper. Rachel's voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. "Who?" Shaq hesitated, just for a second. Then quietly he said a name that made her blood run cold. "Daniel Carter." Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. Her late husband's name. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "You knew him." Shaq nodded. "He saved my life once." Rachel's world tilted. Daniel had died years ago in an accident. He had never talked much about his past before they met, and now, sitting across from her was a man who had just changed her entire world. Because of Daniel. Rachel exhaled shakily. "Tell me everything." Shaq nodded once. "All right." And then, he did. Shaq's voice was steady as he spoke. Years ago, before he became the man he was now, he had nothing. No money, no power. Just a kid from the streets trying to survive. He got mixed up with the wrong people. The kind that don't let you walk away. One night, when everything fell apart, he had been left bleeding in a back alley, waiting to die, until Daniel Carter found him. Rachel's throat tightened. Daniel hadn't known who Shaq was, had no reason to stop. But he did. He pulled Shaq out of that alley, got him to a hospital, and covered his bills. No questions, no expectations, just pure, human decency. Shaq had tried to repay him, tried to track him down years later when he had built himself up. But by then, Daniel was gone. And now, here was Rachel, the woman Daniel left behind, struggling, drowning, about to make a deal with the same kind of men that nearly killed Shaq all those years ago. He couldn't let that happen. Rachel wiped at her eyes before the tears could fall. Her late husband had saved this man's life, and now, that kindness had come full circle. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something worse, a sinking, gnawing feeling in her gut, because she had spent the last few years believing she knew everything about Daniel. And now, for the first time, she realized she didn't know him at all. Rachel inhaled sharply, setting the receipt on the table. "So that's it? You paid, and I just walk away?" Shaq studied her. "That depends." Rachel tensed. Shaq leaned forward slightly, voice calm. "Lily's safe now, but I have a feeling Cameron's not done with you." Rachel's stomach twisted. She knew Cameron Steele well enough to know he didn't like losing. Shaq continued. "I can make sure he doesn't come near you again, but you need to let me handle it my way." Rachel's head spun. This was too much. One minute she was about to sell her soul. The next, she was staring at a man who had just erased her problems with a signature and a check. But she wasn't naive. Nothing in life came without consequences. Rachel clenched her fists, meeting Shaq's gaze. "And what if I say no?" Shaq exhaled through his nose, like he expected the question. "Then I walk away, and you deal with Cameron on your own." A heavy silence settled between them. Rachel knew what that meant. Cameron wouldn't let this go, and she was too tired to fight anymore. Rachel licked her dry lips, her voice barely above a whisper. Fine. Shaq gave a small nod, standing up. Good. I'll be in touch. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts. Her daughter would live. Her debts were gone. And yet, as she stared at the paper in her hands, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Because she had just agreed to something without knowing the cost. And if there was one thing she knew for sure, Big Shaq never made a deal without expecting something in return. Rachel sat in the hospital waiting room, staring at the white walls, the antiseptic smell thick in the air. The receipt in her hands, marked paid in full, felt heavier than any debt she had ever carried. Lily was finally safe, scheduled for surgery in just a few days, but relief refused to settle in. Big Shaq had swooped in like some untouchable savior, wiping away $250,000 with a flick of his wrist. But Rachel wasn't naive. Men like him didn't do things without a reason. He had mentioned Daniel, her late husband, the man she had loved, buried, grieved, the man she had believed she knew everything about. And yet, somehow, in some way, he was tied to Big Shaq. Rachel exhaled sharply, gripping the receipt until her knuckles turned white. She couldn't shake the feeling that the real debt hadn't been paid yet. Across town, Cameron Steele sat in his dimly lit office, whiskey swirling in his glass, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had just lost $250,000. Worse than that, he had lost control. And Cameron hated losing. His reputation was built on one simple rule: no one walked away from his deals without consequences. Rachel Carter had been seconds away from handing over her daughter's future before Shaq stepped in like some self-righteous hero. But Cameron knew better. Shaq wasn't a hero. Everyone had a weak spot, a secret, a past, and Cameron was going to find it. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and waited. The line clicked. I need everything on Shaq. Every deal, every address, every mistake. Go deep. A pause. Then, a low chuckle from the other end. This is going to cost you. Cameron smirked, tossing back the last of his whiskey. Not as much as it'll cost him. Rachel sat in her kitchen, staring at the only photo she had left of Daniel. He had been gone for 3 years, and yet his shadow was still everywhere. She had spent so long believing he had been an open book, a hard worker, a loving father, a man who had left behind nothing but memories. But Shaq's words echoed in her mind. He saved my life once. She needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to her. Rachel grabbed her jacket and left, heading straight to the one place she swore she'd never step foot in again. Big Shaq's world. Shaq's office was in a high-rise overlooking the city, a space that reeked of power, money, and control. When Rachel arrived, the receptionist barely had time to react before she pushed through the glass doors and stepped inside. Shaq stood by the window, phone in hand, deep in conversation. When he saw her, his expression barely changed. I'll call you back. He hung up and turned to face her. Rachel crossed her arms, her chest tight. Tell me about Daniel. Shaq studied her for a moment before gesturing to a chair. Sit. She didn't move. Shaq sighed, rubbing his jaw. It's not what you think. Rachel's fingers dug into her arms. Then tell me what it is. Shaq walked over to his desk, leaning against the edge. Your husband wasn't just some ordinary guy, Rachel. He had history. Rachel's heart pounded. What history? Shaq hesitated for just a moment. Then finally he spoke. Before you knew him, Daniel worked for people like Cameron. Rachel staggered back like she had been hit. Daniel? Working for men like that? It didn't make sense. Shaq continued, his tone steady. He wasn't a criminal, but he knew the game. He knew who to stay away from and who to help. Rachel shook her head, gripping the edge of a chair for balance. He never told me. Shaq exhaled. Because he wanted out. He left it all behind when he met you. Rachel's mind raced, images of her husband flashing through her memory. Was there ever a moment where she had suspected? Number Daniel had been good. But now, the past she thought she understood was unraveling. Shaq's voice softened. The night he died, it wasn't an accident, Rachel. Her breath hitched. Shaq looked at her, unblinking, unwavering. He was taken out. The room spun. Rachel gripped the chair tighter, her vision blurring. No, that's not possible. Shaq's expression darkened. I wish it wasn't. For 3 years, she had believed fate had stolen Daniel from her. Now, she knew the truth. Someone had. And that someone was still out there. Cameron leaned back in his chair, a slow, satisfied smile stretching across his face as his informant finished talking. You were right. Shaq's got skeletons. Cameron's grip tightened around his glass. Tell me everything. As the man on the phone detailed the past Shaq had worked so hard to bury, Cameron felt a new kind of power settle into his bones. He had just found the one thing that could bring Big Shaq crashing down, and he was about to use it. Rachel Carter sat in the dim glow of the hospital room, listening to the steady beeping of the monitors attached to her daughter. Lily lay peacefully in the bed, her tiny chest rising and falling, her face relaxed in a way Rachel hadn't seen in weeks. The surgery had been successful. The nightmare should have been over, but it wasn't. Rachel's relief had barely settled when her phone buzzed with a name that sent ice through her veins. Cameron Steele. She stared at the screen, her fingers clenching around the device. He had no reason to be calling her, not after Shaq had shut him down, not after he had lost. Rachel stepped out into the hallway, glancing toward the nurse's station before answering. What do you want? Her voice was steady, but inside, her stomach churned. Cameron chuckled, slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Now, Rachel, is that any way to talk to someone who did you a favor? Rachel's grip tightened. You didn't do me any favors. Cameron sighed dramatically. I was going to, but then Shaq decided to play the hero. He paused. And now I think it's time you return the favor. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears. There it was, the real reason for his call. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Rachel paced the hallway, her free hand pressed against her forehead. She should have known Cameron wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. I have nothing to say to you, she said, trying to keep her voice even. Cameron let out a quiet laugh. You might want to rethink that, because I know something about your new best friend. Rachel stilled. Shaq. Cameron's voice dropped lower, almost amused. Tell me, Rachel, do you really know the man who just saved your daughter's life? Or did you ever stop to wonder why someone like him would care about someone like you? Rachel's chest tightened. She had wondered, but now wasn't the time for doubt. Shaq's past isn't my problem, Cameron exhaled sharply. It is now. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. What do you want? The line went silent for a moment before Cameron spoke again, his tone smooth and calculating. Shaq ruined my deal. I don't like losing, and I sure as hell don't like being embarrassed. Rachel's fingers curled into a fist. She knew where this was going. So here's the deal. Cameron's voice was lighter now, almost casual. I have information. Information that could destroy Big Shaq's entire empire. The kind of information that doesn't just ruin reputations, it ruins lives. Rachel's stomach twisted painfully. And what do you expect me to do about it? Cameron chuckled again. Simple. You help me bring him down. Rachel's breath caught. He wanted her to betray Shaq. Rachel sank onto a bench in the waiting room, pressing her fingers against her temple. She wanted to hang up, wanted to tell Cameron to go to hell. But then he spoke again. And before you say no, Rachel, let me remind you of something. Another pause. Then his voice turned sharp. Shaq may have saved your daughter, but that doesn't mean you're safe. You don't think I know how much you owe in medical bills? That hospital may have cleared the surgery cost, but what about aftercare? What about the medication, the follow-ups? That money has to come from somewhere. Rachel clenched her jaw, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Cameron's tone darkened. Shaq's a problem, and problems need to be dealt with. You have a choice. Help me, or I make sure you lose everything you've got left. The blood drained from Rachel's face. This was bigger than her now. She thought the nightmare had ended, but Cameron was dragging her into another one. If she turned on Shaq, she would be betraying the man who had saved her daughter's life. If she didn't, Cameron would destroy her. And worse, he might destroy Shaq too. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. every breath feeling heavier than the last. There was no way out, no right answer, no safe choice. She was trapped, and for the first time, she didn't know what to do. Rachel Carter had spent her life fighting battles she never thought she'd win, fighting to keep a roof over her daughter's head, fighting to stretch every dollar, fighting to hold on when the world did everything it could to push her down. But this was the fight that mattered most. Cameron Steele thought he had won. He thought he had backed her into a corner, that fear would break her, that she would fold just like everyone else he had crushed under his boot. He was wrong. Because a mother fighting for her child has nothing left to lose. Rachel sat in Shaq's office, the weight of Cameron's threat pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Across from her, Shaq stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched like he was resisting the urge to slam his fist into the desk. He knew. Cameron had made his move. Rachel took a slow breath and set her phone on the table between them. A single recording, Cameron's voice crystal clear. Shaq's a problem, and problems need to be dealt with. Shaq's eyes darkened as the words played back, but Rachel wasn't done. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Cameron had threatened her. But threats were only as strong as the secrets they protected. Rachel had spent the last 2 days doing what she did best, surviving. And survival meant getting ahead before the enemy struck. She had gone digging. Cameron Steele had spent years building an empire on fear, control, and dirty money. But no empire stood forever. And Rachel? She had found the cracks. She pushed the folder toward Shaq. These are records of Cameron's offshore accounts, laundered money, bribes, the kind of evidence that doesn't just get a man arrested, it buries him. Shaq exhaled slowly, flipping through the pages. His expression didn't change, but Rachel could feel the shift in the air. Cameron thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn otherwise. Cameron sat in his high-rise office, a glass of scotch in his hand, legs crossed like a king surveying his kingdom. He was untouchable. He had played the game for too long, crushed too many opponents. Then his phone buzzed. An email. He clicked it open, his smirk fading as he scanned the documents attached. Bank transfers, shell companies, names tied to accounts he had buried under layers of deception. And at the bottom, a single message. You wanted a war? Here's your battlefield. Let's see if you survive it. His grip tightened on the glass, fury bubbling under the surface. He had underestimated Rachel. That wouldn't happen again. Rachel knew the war wasn't over. Cameron would retaliate. The only question was how. She didn't have to wait long. That night, an anonymous article hit every major media outlet. A deep dive into Big Shaq's past. The headlines were ruthless. The truth about the man behind the money. From the streets to the boardroom, but at what cost? Big Shaq's ties to underground deals exposed. Rachel read every word, her stomach twisting. It was brutal. Cameron had dug into every misstep, every deal Shaq had made in his rise to power. And now, it was out for the world to see. She expected Shaq to be furious, expected rage, expected him to retaliate. Instead, he sat across from her, calm. I knew this was coming. Rachel frowned. You don't seem surprised. Shaq exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Because I spent years trying to erase the man I used to be. But I should have known. Your past never stays buried. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. The real question, Rachel, is do you believe them? Rachel held his gaze, her chest tight. She thought about everything he had done, about how he could have walked away, how he could have let Cameron take what he wanted. But he hadn't. He had saved her daughter. He had given her another chance. Rachel reached across the table, resting her hand on the folder between them. I don't care who you used to be. I care about who you are now. For the first time since she had met him, Shaq smiled. Not the smirk, not the carefully crafted look of power, but something real, something human. Cameron Steele was a man who thrived on control. So when the feds raided his office, when his assets were frozen, when his connections turned their backs on him, he knew he had lost. Rachel sat in the hospital room, Lily sleeping peacefully beside her, as she watched the news unfold. Business mogul Cameron Steele under federal investigation. Ties to illegal dealings confirmed. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. It was over. Days later, Rachel stood by Lily's bed, watching as her daughter blinked awake, her small fingers reaching for her mother's hand. Alive. Safe. She had spent so long fearing the worst, but now, for the first time, there was hope. A shadow filled the doorway. Shaq. Rachel turned, meeting his gaze. There was no debt between them, no contracts, no deals, just understanding. You didn't have to stay, Rachel said softly. Shaq shrugged. Yeah, I did. Rachel nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Sometimes family wasn't about blood. It was about who stood by you when the world turned its back. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel knew. She wasn't alone anymore. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a battle for redemption. Rachel risked everything. Shaq proved that your past doesn't define you. And Cameron learned that power built on fear always crumbles. But what happens when the people you least expect become your greatest allies? Don't miss the next story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Follow now for more high-stakes drama, shocking twists, and characters who refuse to back down.